started. So let me welcome everyone who is here. My name is Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group, which has organized this panel. And before going on to say a couple of things, just to frame the panel and the importance of the topic we are about to discuss, which I don't think can be overstated. Let me just remind everybody that we have regular panels, sometimes, usually about fortnightly, sometimes more frequently. And the next panel is going to be on another equally important topic, and that's on Ukraine and the left. That the exact title is "The Conflict Over Ukraine, Where Should the Left Stand?" And that is on the 7th of August. So today's panel is entitled Socialist States and the Environment, which is also the title of Salvatore Engel-Di Mauro's book, which argues, in a sense, that contrary to the vast propaganda about the environmentally destructive character of socialism and actually existing socialisms, in reality, when looked at closely and objectively, the record of socialist states has actually been far superior to that of the of capitalist countries. So I think that this is a subject that really it is becoming more and more urgent to discuss. We all appreciate that that capitalism, it seems to be in an advanced state of crisis. The crisis pervades many sectors, not just economic, but also public health, international, political, cultural, social. The list is very long, and this is simply par for the course because, of course, crises, the longer they last, the more they spread to other to spheres of society beyond the ones where they initially emerged. However, in the present moment, it almost seems as though on the environmental front, the clock, we were sort of taking a lot of retrograde steps, because a couple of years ago, if anybody would have asked people what was the most important crisis facing humanity, practically everyone would have said something to the effect that it was the ecological emergency, which consists, if you think about it, of global warming, of the loss of biodiversity, and of rising pollution. At the same time, however, at this present time, with the proxy war over Ukraine, etc., the inflation, particularly in food and fuel prices, and so on, you see a retrograde movement back in favor of fossil fuels, which are only going to exacerbate the problem, even as the world suffers from more and more unexpected and extreme weather events. So in this context, we see that there is a crisis of capitalism, and this needs to be tackled. But at the same time, we also see that the left is particularly handicapped in doing so, because particularly the Western left, because for far too long, it has thought of capitalism as somehow possessing Promethean productive abilities, and also, of course, of somehow being more democratic and all sorts of other things. And this has largely been a result of discounting imperialism. So the wealth of Western societies, which is attributed to capitalism's ability to be so productive rather than to imperialism. And of course, partly the discounting of imperialism has also led to discounting actually existing socialisms, because the fact of the matter is that practically all these actually existing socialisms have been the result of revolutions that have been anti-capitalist as well as anti-imperialist. So in this context, the backwardness of the left in a number of these different respects, these are just some of the ways. There are other ways, the overvaluation of liberal democracy, the overlooking of its obvious limitations that are growing more and more apparent day by day, the equating of fascism and socialism rather than fascism and capitalism, etc. But nowhere are the problems of the left's problems and limitations more serious, perhaps, than on the ecological front. Sorry, I'm admitting people at the same time as I'm making my remarks. Yeah, so on the ecological front, the fact of the matter is it's practically taken for granted, not just in the mainstream, but also on the left, that somehow the record of actually existing socialist countries has been far worse than than that of capitalist countries. But the fact of the matter is that capitalism only pretends to do something about the ecological emergency in order that there may be more opportunities, green opportunities for making capitalist profits. Is actually so far proven incapable of really addressing the various environmental problems that constitute the ecological emergency. And whereas in reality, socialist countries, precisely because they have a higher degree of centralized decision-making, centralized policy-making and implementation, etc., that they have historically been more capable of dealing with environmental problems. Indeed, reading Salvatore's book, I was reminded of the fact that those of you who've managed to read volume 3 of Capital, in the opening pages on the sections on rent, Marx says very clearly that you cannot have what he calls a rational agronomy. That is to say, any kind of rational management of the natural world in relation to the human need to reproduce themselves and so on. You cannot really have a rational agronomy in the context where you have private property in land. And I think this underlines the whole problem that I think Salvatore in his book manages to lay out so well. So I would say that in the present context, where ecological issues are such a large part of what holds back left advance, particularly in Western countries, I think Salvatore has performed yeoman's service in the cause of socialism, in the cause of a feasible socialism and sustainable development. And indeed, in terms of thinking about the future of humanity on this planet, by writing a book that makes the case historically and empirically that in fact the record of socialism is far superior to that of capitalism, even though these socialisms are handicapped by the effects of imperialism and have had to develop what they have developed in the face of imperialist resistance. And Salvatore does it with great care, and I would also say great feeling. So I think that the book is definitely worth reading, and we're all here to discuss it. And Salvatore does what he does. He makes his arguments as he does, while maintaining a very fine balance between, on the one hand, the left's concerns about statism, and on the other hand, his insistence that some level of a centralized state strategy is absolutely critical to maintaining environmental sustainability. So inter alia, he reminds us that environmental concerns were actually the core of the first major socialist revolution, that the environmental record of socialism, as I've said several times already, is better, that the concern, the subjective concern of socialist forces for the environment was always much more acute than you find among liberal forces and so on. And as a consequence, they also organized to have far greater scientific advances in terms of understanding the relationship between human social production and the environment. And that all of these we will be discussing. And also, I would like to say that Salvatore's book raises all sorts of other bigger questions. How do we define socialism? Is China socialist today, that is to say after 1978, or not? Why does it matter whether we think about it one way or the other? He also there are also other issues that we can discuss. For example, is North Korea socialist or not? What about China's more recent emphasis on environmental protection in the context of its re-emphasis on socialism, as we've been seeing in the last many years? And of course, finally, and I think Salvatore is also to be congratulated here, because he seems, as one reads along, he seems quite sensitive to a very, very fundamental fact, which is that when we compare the ecological record of capitalism with other countries, the advanced capitalist countries with other countries, we should never discount the role of imperialism, because the fact of the matter is that the imperialist countries have, in a sense, laid waste bulk of the planet already in developing essentially in giving higher materials standards of living to a relatively small proportion of the world's population. So through imperialism, whether it's directly through direct colonialism or not, it has managed to do this. Whereas today's, I mean, if you think about it, the fact of the matter is that people of European origin do not just occupy their home continent, but also occupy 3 or 4 other continents in addition. And this is what this is the result of capitalist development. And this has aided a small part of humanity to appropriate bulk of the fruits of development so far. So the role of imperialism is very central in inflicting damage on the colonized world, and also resulting in a situation in which the colonized world, and including the socialist countries today, they must they must display a precocious level of environmental care and sustainability, because they must do it without having access to vast lands which they appropriate from other countries, other peoples, I should say, and put to the service of their own material betterment. So these are some of the questions that we will be discussing, and I would the way in which we will proceed is that we will have several commentators who will comment on Salvatore's book, raise the questions that they consider very important. So they will go first, and then I will have Salvatore respond, and then we will open up for questions and answers. So I'm sorry, I'm just looking for my email, in which I'm operating with a very different computer. So please bear with me for a second while I find my email in which I had the order of speakers. 1 second. Yes. Okay, so our first speaker will be Max Eil, and I will introduce the speakers as they go along. So let me introduce Max first. So here we go. So yeah, okay. So Max Eil is an associated researcher with the Tunisian Observatory for Food Sovereignty and the Environment. And he's also a postdoctoral fellow with the Rural Sociology Group at the Wageningen University. He's author of A People's Green New Deal. He has written for Monthly Review, Jacobin, and Viewpoint. He has contributed to a number of journals, including the Journal of Peasant Studies, the Review of African Political Economy and Globalizations, and is associate editor at Agrarian South and the Journal of Labor and Society. So Max, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for the introduction. Thank you to Salvatore for writing the book. Thank you to the organizers for putting together the panel. And thank you to my fellow co-panelists and the actually huge number of participants. I don't know if any of the rest of you are in the West like me at the time, but it's a bit early. So this book is long overdue. So thank you so much for writing it. It is exactly what has been needed in order to bring the question of the socialist states' ecological records to a large audience, and in order to bring that into a comparison with the far worse ecological record of the Western states. I also think bringing the fragmentary, but often excellent, or in the case of Cuba, not at all fragmentary, but comprehensively excellent ecological and environmentally protective policies to a wide audience with a great deal of much needed analysis is absolutely critical for our knowledge of the relationship of actually existing socialism and ecological struggle. So thank you so much for all of this. I'm not going to summarize, of course, but I think it's fantastic that, in effect, this raises the possibility for, again, actually existing ecological civilization in several ways. First of all, Cuba. Second of all, to point to, without coming to definitive conclusions, because history has not yet given us definitive conclusions about the contemporary unclear ecological orientation of China. Essentially, I have one critical comment, and then related basically to the logic of comparison. And then I have a couple of questions and requests for elaboration. my first and my main point of disagreement may seem a bit technical, and it has to do with this question related to the logic of comparison. It's technical, but actually I think it's very important politically in terms of how we understand the record of the actually existing socialist system, and for that matter, non-socialist national developmental states. So, of course, we have various kinds of comparison, and I think they're very helpful for bringing into a kind of direct, although necessarily empirical, analysis of the relative quantitative records of the distinct social formations. The author also calls for a kind of relational kind of comparative framework using world systems analysis, drawing here from Minky Lee, and pointing out that, for example, and as Radhika was elaborating on, that whereas imperialism has produced for profit and has produced ecological waste in periphery and the core, that is on a world scale, this has generally not happened in the socialist countries. So of course, I agree in general that the unit of analysis has to always be the world system, and therefore the process of accumulation on a world scale, structured by the global law of value. It seems to me that there is a bit of an inconsistency, which I actually makes it better rather than worse, when it comes to the logic of comparison. For example, Salvatore points out, and here I wanted much more elaboration actually, that the socialist system, in fact, may have somehow restrained capitalist emissions. And that this also occurs in an analogous way, that the socialist system was a major promoter of the international environmental treaties in the 1970s, where the US was the major promoter. And elsewhere, Salvatore occasionally, although I think it needed to actually be said much more firmly, that the capitalist system imposed the need for defensive industrialization in the actually existing socialist states. Now, this is actually not exactly to me anymore a relational comparison. This seems to me incorporated or constitutive comparison, where the processes occurring at the same time in distinct geographical locations in the world system are actually constituting one another over time, right? And that insofar as those processes emanate from different social logics, this helps us better to understand responsibility, right? So insofar as the Soviet Union in its imperfect form crystallized a different logic at certain moments of how to constitute the world system, this is one logic that was pushing, and that is, of course, to socialism's credit. And then there are, of course, other social logics, namely the capitalist one, pushing, of course, in a different direction. Now, what I think is very important is that when we think about industrialization, right? Because of course, industrialization, of course, there's agricultural destruction of the environment. It can be very important. But in the modern period, we're overwhelmingly discussing industrialization, starting even from pre-1917, when it comes to ecological breakdown in the world system. Now, it seems to me that there has been no possibility for any country in the world system to carry out a path of industrialization that obeys a socially rational and ecologically rational, or even a self-determined logic, right, outside of the threats imposed upon countries by capitalism and imperialism. It's quite impossible. And this even extends to countries that are not necessarily under direct threat, but themselves absorb the logic of forced industrialization through some way of copying the Soviet model, which itself was a more or less direct product of the need for defensive industrialization against the Western capitalist and fascist forces, right? So I think this needed to actually be said in a much more firmer way and integrated more into the argumentative and comparative fabric of the book, in order that we understand that the environmental crisis is a northern crisis, right? This is, I think the book makes it clear, very clear empirically through the case studies. I think the argument is actually present. throughout, which is why I was saying that I thought the inconsistency is to the book's credit, but I thought this could have been brought out much more clearly in certain places. The environmental crisis is a northern crisis. The environmental crisis is not a southern crisis. The environmental crisis is not really a crisis of socialism, except insofar as domestic social forces within socialist states decide that there is too much ecological damage impinging upon them, right? I mean, this is a northern crisis through and through, which also I think brings it into an important perspective, the debate on so-called extractivism within the radical nationalist or social democratic or socialist states of Latin America, that they're responding to a northern imposed crisis, including their position in the International Division of Labor. So I have one question that kind of elaborates on that, and then I have just a series of questions that I thought, because Salvatore knows a lot, I assume there maybe can add to some of the discussion. So one is, where is the Mao era people science and agroecology that was occurring in China from in the 1950s, the 1960s, and 1970s, right? And this is a very important part of the early Maoist ecological record that I think is incredibly important to bring to people's attention, especially in a moment where agroecology is justifiably gathering more and more attention in the West. And in fact, it's very important to know that some of this was being adopted in China during this period, but almost exactly analogous forms of technical packages that are now being kind of valorized as agroecology. Second of all, what about the question of historical per capita right to the atmosphere, again, in the discussion over China? That is, once we break out, this following on Jason Hickel's work, if we actually map out the historical per capita emissions over time that is related directly to population, we find that China has barely, accepting in an empiricist perspective, right? We find that China has barely overshot any sort of historical right to the atmosphere. We allot emissions on a per capita basis. And third, related to the influence of China, I wonder if the author has anything to say about the influence of China on Western popular socialist ecology in the 1960s and 1970s, as some of these people science movements had their reflection on the Western left, in particular because of the widespread influence of Maoism on the Western left in the 1960s, 70s, including delegations I know that went to China and would see the agricultural policies in effect. And four, and I think this is the most challenging one, however we want to characterize the post-Mao People's Republic of China. Actually, it is a very important question, but it is not actually related. I don't think it's directly related to the question of understanding what, in fact, is the historically necessary level of development of the productive forces in order to break capitalist imperialism and to build up sufficient industrial capacity to protect oneself from the US capacity to enforce the law of value on a world scale. And in this sense, deterrence in one national territory, Iran is carrying out deterrence in one national territory. China's carrying out deterrence on one national territory. More success for China, obviously, than for Iran, is insufficient, right? Because it's a world system and you can be damaged outside of your sovereign territory. What kind of industrial capacity, which is polluting in its very nature, industrialization is polluting in its very nature, is necessary to protect oneself and actually shatter the US worldwide law of value, which itself is the primary source of ecological destruction on a world scale. I mean, this is something that, to an extent, sidesteps the question of how we characterize the post-Mao PRC and clarifies that there is a necessary level of industrialization in order to prevent the US from continuing to destroy the entire ecological substrate of the world system. And I think this is an urgent question for eco-socialists. So I'm done, and thank you so much for putting this together and for your work.
Thank you so much, Max. That was a really powerful beginning. And I think that you are absolutely right to remind us of what I shall perhaps recast slightly as the, shall we say, the productive or generative inconsistencies, as you may call them, in Salvatore's book. But, obviously Salvatore has put a lot of things on the agenda, and we can use that act as an opportunity to open these questions up. But the point you raise is critically important. The whole question of the mutual conditioning of the imperial world and the imperialized world, which includes the socialist countries of today. And you pointed out that we need to not just compare them, but to look at their incorporation in the wider world system, which I, in a different terminology, often also refer to as the logic of uneven and combined development. So thanks very much for that excellent intervention. Our next speaker is Andrew Pendakis, and let me just briefly introduce Andrew. Andrew is assistant professor of theory and rhetoric at Brock University in Canada and a research fellow at Shanghai University of Finance and Economics in China. His research focuses on contemporary political and economic culture, with a special interest in the genealogy of centrist reason in the West. He has written many essays, philosophical essays on Badiou, Heidegger, Sartre, and on topics ranging from the new entrepreneurialism to dialectics. And these writings have appeared in Criticism, Imaginations, these are all journals, Imaginations, Politics and Culture, South Atlantic Quarterly, and Meditations. Andrew is also co-editor of Contemporary Marxist Theory, a reader on with Bloomsbury Press, and he's currently working on a monograph entitled A Critique of Centrist Reason. So Andrew, please go ahead. I did have a message from Andrew saying he was having some difficulty getting in. Maybe he was not able to get back in. Okay, if it's all right, Ipsita, I will go to you, and while we wait for Andrew to come back in. So sorry about that, folks. Let me introduce Ipsita in that case. 1 second. Okay, oh dear, I haven't got, I'm sorry, Ipsita, I seem to have lost your bio. Would you mind please briefly introducing yourself and making your remarks? Many apologies.
Sure, I think that's how, this is a divine intervention. Bios are so redundant. I'm Ipsita Chatterjee, Associate Professor, University of North Texas. I'm a fellow geographer along with Salvatore. I think we are the only two geographers. I think I'm going to stake a claim on this, that in the 101 participants, we are the only two geographers here. So I work on globalization, labor, identity. My most recent book monograph is the alt-right movement. I also co-edit a journal called Human Geography, a new radical journal, along with Salvatore. So that's about it when it comes to me. This is how Saeed's book looks like. And it's carefully curated with post-it notes to show that I've actually read it. I would like to know later on which part is the capitalist future, which part is the the blue and the black, and the thinking behind it. I think plenty has been written on this, not as much as we would want, the socialist states and the environment. This is the part that interests me, because this is the audacity of hope, eco-socialist futures. Not many, faint of heart, to attempt this, the eco-socialist future. 10 minutes is not enough to talk about Saeed and his book, because it's a manifestation of who he really is. He's a deeply compassionate human being. And so the book is a yearning of his soul for a compassionate future. And by that, I mean a future that involves a compassionate existence with nature and society, hence eco-socialist. So there is this idealism, there is this utopianism, which I very much like in an era where idealism is dead. But it is not a naive sort of an idealism. And that this is because Saeed is what I write in my notes, the unboxable one. Some of us, as we develop our careers, we are always building a brand. and you can easily box us. This is what this person, you cannot. You cannot do that to him. And that is why he embraces contradictions. Many of us always try to resolve or solve contradictions. The book does not attempt to do that. It presents contradictions and it learns from it and it uses it as its strength, because that is who he is. He is the unboxable one. He's Salvatore, but he's also Said. He is a geomorphologist, what we say in physical geography, geomorphologist, but he also discusses social theory and feminist theory. He's an anarcho-socialist, but chair of his department. Only he can, encapsulate these contradictions. And that comes through in the book in a beautiful synthesis that is very dialectical. So I like the fact that this book is deeply metaphorical and symbolic, at the same time, very empirical and literal. And I think it is intentional, but it is seamless and it is hard to achieve. In the preface, he begins with I don't know if many of you read the preface. He begins with the story of the Mars Mountains, where the fairies knew how to convert dirt into gold. And the people, so this is the interaction between idealism and materialism. The people made fun of the fairies. So let me read out a little bit from there and show you how he makes these transitions from material to the ideal, from the mythical to the real. So the magical Mars Mountains, the quick and lively interlocking mountain streams, the glacial refashioning of land yielding concentrations of gold, ancient land struggles, the skilled fairies, the modern breakthrough seekers, and the best means to get the elusive gold. This is the long, rocky, slippery, shining, trap-riddled path of recovering and rebuilding socialism. Feel the words. So socialism is that philosophical gold. And he says that the path is rock-ridden and it's not easy. So there is a utopian future to be grasped at, but it is not naive. It is going to be a struggle. And rebuilding socialism, including anarchism and communism, are that actually existing struggles that we have to go through to reach this utopian future. And he doesn't advocate for one or the other. It has to be anarchism. It has to be communism. He shows them and defines them in their beautiful relationality, but tells us that there are available paths to this philosophical gold that we must transmute and we must make our own. So this is very symbolic, the words. It's very metaphorical. And then look at his absolute disdain, absolute gut-wrenching anger for any formulaic variety of socialism. So he says, aside from various, page 49, aside from various forms of often repressive, if not mass murdering, statism and misguided vanguardism, there were also traces of Saint-Simonianism in the self-congratulatory importance given to parties as omniscient guides or incarnations of the proletariat. So it's the formulaic variety, the degenerate varieties of socialism. So between these two, these are the contradictions that he's presenting. And he's saying that we have to be aware of this. And in being aware of it, we must excavate the philosophical gold through struggle to arrive at eco-socialist futures. Connecting these two extreme realities is a statement. Ethereal flight necessary to reach beyond the concreteness of the present and the restraints of the past. So that's the conceptual flight that we must undertake in order to recoup the philosophical gold through this path of struggle. We are aware, he says, I am aware that the concreteness of the present, the material concreteness, the material realities of the present are going to be a problem. The fact that there can be degenerate varieties of socialism is going to be a problem. And I'm aware that there were many historical wrongs in the socialist future, yet it is possible. So this seamless transition between the metaphorical and literal is very, very appealing to me. It's hard to do when you are dealing with the blood and gore in a topic that is really difficult. The other thing that I like about the book is its intellectual humility. It presents chaos as is, doesn't do it from a critical distance. Often it is very normal to begin these books with a rant against capitalism, talk a lot about accumulation theory, spend half of the book on Marx and Harvey and the rest of it. He doesn't do it. He presents the contradictions of socialism. And so the critic is embedded in the criticism. I think that is the intellectual humility, because you're not trying to critique something from a distance, from an Archimedean point. You're saying that this is the problem, I'm part of the problem, how are we going to transcend it? And so I like that part of it, the intellectual humility. In many ways, it gives a steering wheel to the audience, make what you will of it. And that is who he is, who very much he is. To give an example from the real world, one of my first moments with Saeed was I saw him in one of the corporate conferences that all disciplines have, the annual conferences, and he was moderating a series of sessions from early morning till midday, and he was the moderator of each of these sessions. So when the 8 o'clock session ended and the 10 o'clock session was supposed to begin, he just stood up and said that I'm hungry and I must get food. So do what you have to do. He was the moderator of the session. He left to get breakfast, and the entire room broke into a pandemonium, but they settled down and we had a very rich discussion. So that's the intellectual humility. I don't have to be there. I brought you guys here, make what you will of it. So I really liked that. It was not a lot of pages consumed in discussing accumulation theory. It was about this is the problem and make what you will of it. I like that it is globe girdling, brings examples from all over the world, and yet it is very, very grounded. It is a case study based, it's empirically grounded. And here is the historical materialist analysis, bringing us case studies from the PRC, from Cuba, from countries in Africa, from the USSR. And I can imagine how much research this must have required. Environmental history, environmental geopolitics is not easy to piece together. And to connect them into a seamless narrative must have been really hard. The other thing that I liked is the poverty of comparison chapter. I liked that, Saeed, you use the master's tool to dismantle the master's house. Often a reaction to empiricism is a navel-gazing qualitative ethnography, and you didn't do that. And again, this is your contradiction. You're trained in this empirical tradition, but you're really dialectical, you embrace the contradictions. Most of us are taught from early on that solve the problem, hide the contradiction, resolve it. Something happened to you, it got dropped in your head or something when you were growing up, that you never try to do that. Take the problem and present it in its relationality. So you say that the problems with eco-socialist comparisons or in any kind of ecological narrative is that selective evidence, where you cast socialist countries in the poor light and period. That's it. And there is no explanation for it. The other problem you say is that the comparative framework itself is never explained. Why you're choosing this and that. And often it is comparison between apple and oranges. And that is not made explicit. And the third problem you say is that it is often absolutist. That is, you fixate on environmental disasters from socialist countries. And these were very interesting to me because you challenge empiricism head on, challenge the logic of logical empiricism, and you show us that what claims to be rational is not actually rational. I would have liked more examples of these problems. This is an example of a work that does absolutist comparison. And so that would have, I think, punched through the wall in terms of the case that you're making. I will end with two other conceptual moments, I think, which are very important in the book, but are understated. And then you can respond about them later on in your 1 hour talk back to us. I think this chapter, Poverty of Comparison, is deeply appealing to me because you use ecological variables like methane emissions, carbon dioxide emissions. This is what I mean by using the master's tool. You use environmental variables and you do a temporal study and you show, make a comparison between the capitalist world and the socialist world. What excited me was the use of the world system categories, capitalist core, socialist semi-periphery, periphery. And I thought it was intentional. It was kind of the start or the entry point to an ecological world system theory. And that is what interested me. We are all aware of the problems of world system and dependency analysis. It doesn't deal with class, it doesn't deal with gender, it doesn't deal with ethnicity. But having taught development for some time now, I know the appeal of it. And students immediately grasp and understand capitalism in a spatial logic that need not be static. And so I thought this was intentional to use ecological variables and show us how the socialist world is not this idealistic space that has existed outside capitalism, but has always been imbricated and in a relational coexistence with capitalism. So the ecological narratives of the socialist nations that comes from the capitalist nations cannot be imagined as an isolated outside. Here, you clearly state that the capitalist world has had impacts on the socialist world. And we have to understand this in a hyphenated way. And I think this was moving to a very interesting place. If I can find the page. So on page 97, you say that the wider context of socialist states has always been a capitalist world system whose existence is contingent on endless capital accumulation. That is, the primary motivation to produce anything is supposed to be to gain profits. Above all, the capitalist world system is predicated on forcing other societies into developing capitalist social structures and thereby enter into subordinated relations to a capitalist core. The outcome is the establishment and reproduction of highly uneven development at all scales, meaning the most of humanity's life chances are contingent on the prerogatives of handful of capitalists. So you sort of show us how the socialist worlds and all this have never been the outside. And I think this was a good place to develop an ecological world system theory of extraction, where in the Amin and Thrift and André Frank tradition, you show how the extraction is not always through the mechanism of trade, like they do in the mechanism of trade and calculating surplus value in terms of copper production and copper extraction from Bolivia counted as extraction through trade contributed to the extraction of surplus value. But if you could show how nature is a mechanism of this extraction, how nature is a mechanism of this exploitation, how nature is a mechanism of this imperialism in the post-colonial neoliberal world, where the extraction is in the form of the commodity form, but the commodity form embeds nature, like carbon dioxide or methane. This is nature. This is extraction from nature. Carbon dioxide emissions, methane emissions, manifested through the commodity form is an extraction from other worlds, third world, semi-socialist, socialist nations, but also extraction from the environmental commons. So creation of a world system theory, which is based more on ecological variables, I think is needed in a crisis-ridden environmental, environmental crisis-ridden world. So I think that's one thing. It was not pushed further, the ecological environmental dependency aspect of it. The second thing I think is not only is there a poverty of comparison, I think there is also poverty of concepts and how we imagine the environment or nature. And if you look at socialist and Marxist literature, you will find that there's not a lot of times that the term environment or ecology is used. It's nature. And I think we need to think about an alternative theory of nature. That's a non-extractive theory of nature and human coexistence. And I think the problematic aspect often is that we use some of the same categories that empiricism and logical empiricism has thrown at us: environment, ecology. And they tend to be very analytical. It's very, very boxed out. Think of the flow diagrams that we talk about. What it does is externalizes nature, simplifies nature. And what it also does, it creates a receptacle where we can fix the problem, right? Oh, so wind up. So I think there is a need to disrupt the categories as well. The last thing that I wanted to finish up with is the book is highly dialectical. And I think Marx uses metaphor for dialectics. The contradictions are very enriching. So I think he talked about the bat. You don't know whether it's a bird or a beast. And so the book is a little bit like that. It's very tongue-in-cheek. You don't know if he's talking for socialism or against socialism. So the dialectics is there, it's implicit, and you talk about it in the end, that the purpose is not to prove anything. It is the relationality of it. I think that needed to be amped up. If you look at Engels's work on the dialectics of nature, he tells us that one of the fundamental aspects of dialectics is how quantitative and qualitative aspects are related. So, and I think that is there in your book, where you're showing that quantitative additions of carbon dioxide, methane, qualitatively changes nature. So this tension between quantitative and qualitative, empiricism and dialectics, is there in your book, but it comes as the last chapter. The reason why I think it should come as the first chapter is because we are not intuitively dialectical as people. It's not because I like dialectics, but because we don't know how to be dialectical. And if you could show us that the methodology of the book is dialectical, then a lot of us would know how to replicate it. And so I think the dialectical aspect, we can have more discussions in your next hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ipsita. That was really interesting. And I should just like to say, as part of my way of making up my lapse in introducing you, that in addition to the points that Ipsita made herself when introducing herself, she is the author of 3 books. The first one is called Displacement, Revolution, and the New Urban Condition. The second one is called Spectacular Cities, Religion, Landscape, and the Dialectics of Globalization. And finally, and very interestingly, her most recent book is called The Alt-Right Movement, Dissecting Racism, Patriarchy, and Anti-Immigrant Xenophobia. And I should also add that, of course, these movements have also been in the forefront of climate change denial. So moving right along, I should just say that I've heard from Andrew Pendakis. He's trying to join back, but he's having some difficulty. We hope he can join us soon. But for now, we will go on to Professor Xiaochang Peng. Professor Peng taught at Rollins College in the United States before going back to China, and he now works at Fudan University in Shanghai. Professor Peng received his PhD from University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which is, of course, as many of you may know, is known for its heterodox economics, where Professor David Kotz, one of the leading such heterodox economists, was his chief advisor. So, Xiaochang, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Radhika, for inviting me to be part of this panel. And it's my great honor to discuss Salvatore's important book along with many insightful participants on this panel. First, I would like to express my gratitude to Salvatore for having written such an excellent, timely book to make a major contribution to the alliance between red and green in today's world. As we all know, the ecological crisis is still accelerating in today's world dominated by capitalism. So, and in much of the conventional wisdom or mainstream discourse of the ecological crisis, there is no space for socialism. It looks like socialism is a completely forgotten reality buried in the past. So Salvatore's book has fully reminded us of the importance of combining useful elements from the actual experience of building socialism with the need to find an alternative path to build a eco-friendly economy for today's world. And in particular, I think Salvatore has looked at the experiences of state socialist experience of building socialism and how their consequences or implications for the environment, how that could be related to our current efforts of building the alliance between the red and the green. To me, because I was born in China and I spent 20 years of studying and doing research in the US, but now I'm back to China. To me, I think one of the crucial tasks is to show that China's socialist experience has a lot to do with our efforts to build a sustainable economy for the world. I think, theoretically speaking, the most impressive point Salvatore made in his book is that he put the state socialist experience and his evaluation of the environmental or ecological consequences of such an experience in a very clear historical context. So contextualization, I think, is the biggest advantage of Salvatore's book. And I think there are several different ways we can think about Salvatore's contextualization of it in the book. But I think the best way is to think about a special term, that is stage of development. For most of us, stage of development may mean the technical level of development, for example, the per capita GDP or whatever. But I think maybe one of the hidden points in Salvatore's book is that stage of development is not such a technical understanding. Stage of development is in terms of the world historic transition from capitalism to socialism. And what we call the state socialist countries, they are actually right in that transition period from capitalism to socialism. So whatever bad lessons they may have offered us in terms of some destructive consequences on the environment should be understood in terms of their forced interactions with the capitalist world economy, even including penetrations of imperialist forces into the socialist countries. And of course, in terms of the defensive measures the newly born socialist countries they had to take in order to defend their political order against imperialist countries. So the rest of my talk today, I would like to, because again, to make the full use of my Chinese background, I would like to share some of my feelings about Salvatore's discussion of the Chinese experience with Salvatore and with the rest of the participants today. I would like to offer a basic theoretical framework containing three elements or three relationships. The first one is the relationship between knowledge about the environment or science on the one hand and politics on the other. And I would like to say that in terms of stage of development, China, even in the Maoist period, was still a little bit behind the average level of ecological science compared with the rest of the developed world, despite Mao's consistent efforts to try to raise ecological awareness. And second relationship is capital versus people. This is pretty self-apparent. The third relationship is domestic versus foreign, or domestic development priorities versus the influences from the rest of the world. So, so with this basic three element environment in mind, I would like to compare the three periods of Chinese experience since 1949. The first period is a Maoist period. The second one is from 1978, where the start of the reform opening up till 2012, which is when Xi Jinping took power. And the third period is the past 10 years or so, when Xi Jinping has somewhat come back to some of the traditional measures that was very influential in Maoist period. So if we compare the three different time periods of the People's Republic of China, then we can easily see that we can fully acknowledge the point made by Salvatore in his book. That is that despite interactions or forced interactions with the rest of the capitalist world economy, state socialist countries still made very impressive successes in supporting a sustainable, ecological sustainable economy for the humanity. So first, let's look at brief look at the Maoist period. Again, like I said, in Maoist period, Mao had a very clear consciousness of building an ecological science. I think Max in his earlier remark talked about that. So in the late 1950s, as early as the late 1950s, Mao created a very famous it's called 8-character charter of agriculture. 8 character means 8 Chinese characters or 8 Chinese words. And those 8 points actually summarize a good balance, very good balance between agroecology, agroecological techniques, and useful modern agricultural techniques that can be compatible or incorporated into agroecology techniques. For example, the second Chinese character in that charter is called the fertilizers, but that doesn't mean chemical fertilizers only. It actually means a good balance between a natural manure or green fertilizers and chemical fertilizers. Yes, around the time of Mao's death in the early to mid 1970s, with normalization of Chinese-American relationship, Chinese government imported several equipments from the US to produce more natural chemical fertilizers. But the focus, the precondition that Mao emphasized has always been that the basis is to insist on the production of natural manure or green fertilizers. So it's extremely different from the current, the subsequent post-1978 reliance on chemical fertilizers. Also, importantly, is the fourth character, which is seeds. So we are very familiar with the harmful effects of the GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and this Western originated technique certainly has been dominated by the capital motive. But in Mao's period, seeds it was dominated by the more eco-friendly hybrid seeds. And in the West, in the English world, most people probably would say the Philippines as the pioneer in engineering hybrid seeds. But China indeed, in Maoist period, at least was a part of the global pioneering efforts to invent some of the important hybrid crops, including wheat, including rice, corn, etc., etc. And that's again to reckon with what Max said before, and that's based on number one, the collective agriculture infrastructure, including the people's commune infrastructure. And number two, based on a people's campaign. It's like the protracted people's war that China did in the Second World War against Japan. So it's actually a people's war of trying to do large-scale experiments involving the masses in the people's commune, and without that, without the entire system and the movement of people's commune, China was not able to, again, we all know that China, how poor, how backward the Chinese economy and agricultural system was around the time People's Republic of China was founded in 1949. But within the next 10 to 15 years, China was able to invent such a good system of hybrid crops is largely because of the state socialist advantage. And we shouldn't forget that the rural basis of that state socialist system actually was a pretty autonomous people's commune system. But again, there's a lot of I think a lot of the mainstream coverage of the people's commune period again was out of the evidence or historical facts, but I won't touch more on that. So this is the Maoist period. So the first relationship, knowledge and politics, certainly we needed some time passage to allow socialist ecological science to develop, but China quickly caught up with the rest of the world. And in terms of the other two dimensions, it's self-apparent. People definitely were put first before capital, and China basically was cut off from important economic interactions with the rest of the capitalist world economy. But what about post 1978, particularly in comparison to the post 2012 experience? Several of the previous speakers have talked about the need to evaluate the nature of the current Chinese political economy system. But I think it's less important to give it a name, just like a state socialist name that we have given to the Mao period. It's less important than thinking about the process of China's socialist building experience right now. I think it's more important to think of Chinese system right now as a continuation of the struggle between the pro-socialist forces and the pro-capitalist forces. It's particularly important because if you call the post-1978 Chinese system as a state capitalist or even straightforward capitalist system, then how can you make sense of the post-2012 partial return to the traditional state socialist system under the Xi Jinping presidency? So it's hard to make sense of that. And we don't want to rigidify our understanding of, well, we don't want to adopt a static approach to understanding the Chinese system. We want to emphasize the dynamic nature of the whole process. So, for example, right now, even though China has a very big private sector that's basically dominated by the logic of capital motivation. However, the Chinese state still assumes primary control even of the primary sector. Just to give you a personal account. So we and
Salvatore, please wrap up soon. Yeah.
Okay. Give me just 2 minutes. Okay.
Of course.
All right. So Salvatore, I think you discussed the smog in China, which was fairly common in the 2000s through the mid 2010s. But in the past several years, I returned to China often, and now I have been living in China for 2 years. And blue skies basically have returned to China, which was rarely seen 10 years ago. So Chinese government is indeed having authority over the regulation of environmental standards in China, which has greatly improved against the previous post-1978 period. So that's why we shouldn't just call China a capitalist state or country or economy, because the state socialist element of a strong proletarian state is still exercising its function in some key areas like environmental regulation. So okay, let me stop here. And again, I want to thank you, Salvatore, for having contributed such a important work to our ecological movement of combining red with green. Thank you much.
Thank you so much, Zhao Chang, and sorry to interrupt you, but we do have to think about the time. But I think you've brought up some really excellent points, particularly with regard to thinking about what's happening in China as a process, and indeed as a dialectical process, a process of struggle between forces who have perhaps different viewpoints. Okay, let me go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ingo Schmidt. Ingo is academic coordinator of the Labor Studies program at Athabasca University in Canada, and his work focuses on international political economy and labor movements. His recent book include Reading Capital Today, 3 Worlds of Social Democracy, and finally, Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital. So Ingo, please go ahead.
Thanks very much for the invitation, for the introduction, and for everybody who is here. Before I start, I might add, before moving to Canada, I grew up in West Germany, but most of my family lived in East Germany, in Salvatore's language, in state socialist East Germany. So I have some personal insights into how state socialist societies did work as long as they existed. And I guess that shaped my outlook more than living in exile in Canada today. Anyways, I will proceed the following way. I mention some agreements, make some critical remarks, and end with some silences that I found in the book, but maybe we can voice those things. On the agreement front, I think it's crucial, sadly enough, in the Western left to talk about the state, about taking state power, and that looking back at socialist history and experiences includes, of course, those societies that might be labeled state socialist. I actually like the embrace of that term. Many of my friends would not like it because they say it's contradictory and you can't have both socialism and the state. But I think it's one of the strengths of Salvatore to say, well, the reality was as contradictory as we didn't like it to be, but that's what we have to cope with. And the tension between the two, I think, is crucial in understanding the trajectories. Excuse me, it's pretty hot here in Europe at this point. To understand the trajectory of state socialist societies. And I also agree very much with pointing out that actually existing liberal democracies always come with neo-colonialism and all the racism and sexism that's ingrained into them, and that therefore it's quite hypocritical to present Western liberal democracies as a shining example to the world. So, having mentioned the agreements, I move on to the critical remarks. And here, of course, I have to start with Salvatore's very positive judgment of the environmental record of state socialism. Fair enough, I appreciated the discussion about the poverty of comparisons, but I also, being trained as an economist, loving data, also liked seeing some data, and I can see that compared to the Western world, the Soviet Union, Cuba, China, and some others could possibly be added, didn't as bad as we are told they did. However, comparing with the Western capitalist imperialist centers is setting the bar pretty low, I would say, possibly too low when it comes to the survival of humanity. We have to do much better in the future if we want to build a sustainable society. I should also mention that looking at data and figuring, while the time when the Soviet Union achieved kind of some progress in terms of ecological footprint is also the time when it moved towards economic stagnation. It wasn't exactly a goal of the CPU USSR to stagnate. They wanted to continue to grow, and if they had achieved that, I'm not so sure we would have seen the positive environmental effect that Salvatore is pointing out. And of course, countries trying to build socialism in the post-colonial world that didn't even have much of a chance, as Salvatore pointed out in the book, to industrialize. How they would have done ecologically, we don't know, because they never got to the point of trying out. But I will now kind of shift a little bit my discussion from ecological aspects to, let's say, political ones. As I said, I appreciate mentioning that liberal democracy is a quite self-serving, hypocritical concept. We Westerners being so much better than the rest of the world. However, what I would say is that as we need to criticize actually existing liberal democracies, we should not throw out the ideas standing behind liberal democracy. And I'm saying that with a particular view on the development of state socialism, because in those countries that could be labeled state socialist, the ideas of liberal democracy were quite powerful in actually bringing those economies, societies, and political systems down. So whatever their ecological record might have been, if they weren't sustainable, which they obviously weren't politically, something very serious must have been wrong with those societies. And I think it's important to recognize that the way the political system was set up contributed massively to their own, to the bringing down of the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. And this brings me to my final point, the silences that I found in the book. On two levels, political and economic, if you will. There isn't much talk, or there isn't any talk what kind of state could be conducive to sustaining itself politically, but also building an ecological and socially more equitable society. And there's also no talk about what kind of forces of production might be possible, might be needed to guarantee sustainability in ecological terms. There is quite some talk about the effects of industrialization. This is the ecological data that I appreciated. There's something about soil and agriculture, and I understand this is Salvatore's specialty, but the kind of basic questions, what should be produced, with which methods should it be produced, and who is deciding about what and how is produced, kind of, if you will, the most basic questions of all economic systems, are not mentioned at all. And they're obviously related to political systems, because you need, and here I totally agree with Salvatore, obviously some kind of, it's beneficial to be clear about where power lies, and if you want democratic powers, you also have to find out how to make sure that you can have the advantages of some centralized decision-making, but also democratic participation of the people. Now, one could say asking for an alternative type of forces of production is the most economistic question one could possibly ask, fitting in with the worst traditions of the Second International, of Soviet Marxism, everything that many on the Western left surely do not like. However, I suggest that in discussing these questions or opening up a debate about them, we should embrace a term that is commonly associated with Western Marxism, which is alienation. And it's actually wrongly just associated with Western Marxism. I will end on that note in a short moment. But why do I think alienation is an important problem? Well, if you go back kind of to the basic theory that Marx put forward in the economic philosophical manuscripts about alienation, you could easily add one aspect, or the alienation of humans from their product, if you consider that whatever humans produce to reproduce their own lives is essentially part of non-human nature, and humans are part of their nature themselves. if one considers that, one can see various, one can easily incorporate ecology into the concept of alienation. And this is so important, I believe, because what I have seen, like in my family, with people working politically in the East, but also from a lot of study, is that there was people in actually existing socialist societies were alienated from the political system, and therefore they were not too concerned about a lot of things. For example, being keen on deciding what is produced, how it's produced. If you read the Constitution of East Germany, it actually reads pretty good. It was pretty democratic, all great. But if you've been around, you see it was completely shallow, and the workers who supposedly were empowered didn't do anything to defend it when parts of the bureaucracy decided it's better to go full-on capitalist to turn bureaucratic privilege into a serious class position. And if that's the case, I think if people are alienated from the political system and from nature, we have to find ways of organizing and conceiving of the state that makes it more exciting for people to really take part in democracy, and not let the bureaucrats rule, complain about them, and be happy if you find any chance to escape them. And I promised to end on a note saying that alienation is not just an idea invented by Western Marxists. By the way, the texts on which Western Marxists drew were published in Eastern Europe, in Moscow and East Germany, including the economic philosophical manuscripts that I already mentioned. But in terms of recovering the history of state socialism, I think it's not only important to look like Salvatore did at ecological data, it's also important to look at the history of communist dissidents that existed in those countries. And there was quite a number. Salvatore, I know, did work on Hungary. Agnes Heller comes to mind, but in all formerly communist countries, you would find dissidents who were open to the concept of alienation. They were not anti-communist. They were concerned that actually existing socialism didn't engage workers the way it should to be sustainable politically and by extension also ecologically. And thereby I suggest that we incorporate questions of alienation into our deliberations on searching eco-socialist future. And those are my remarks, and I thank everybody for their attention.
Thank you very much, Ingo. I also, just let me say a couple of organizational points. I believe Andrew still has not been able to get back in, which is a sad loss, but we will continue as we must. So I will now introduce the last of the commentators before I will ask Salvatore to respond. So the last speaker commenting on this theme is Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a lawyer, journalist, and activist, and he's also a former candidate for the leadership of the Green Party of Canada. Full disclosure, I served on Dimitri's team, on his campaign team, as his chairing his platform committee. And I should like to say that even though I'm sure this comes across as very partial, that he campaigned on an extremely strong eco-socialist platform and managed to inspire a very large number of Canadians to join the Green Party, and lost very narrowly, which is a real pity if people who knew the subsequent fate of the Green Party, which people who know its fate will appreciate. Anyhow, let me also say about Dimitri that he is a very leading public figure who has taken uncompromising and important stances, not only on eco-socialist issues, but also on important international issues such as Venezuela, Israel, Palestine, etc., and also, of course, has paid the political price for them. So Dimitri, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anantika. And I'm going to, in fact, my comments are going to elaborate upon some of the struggles that you just mentioned within the Green Party, particularly here in Canada. As someone who has been active in Green Party politics for many years, I think that Salvatore's confirmation that socialism is superior from an environmental perspective than capitalism could not have come at a more important time. As we all know, at the heart of the capitalist ethos is the imperative of individual profit maximization. And as I never tire of telling my fellow Green Party members, an imperative of that nature will always result in environmental destruction as a consequence of capitalism's prioritization of individual profit maximization over the public good. Business owners in a capitalist economy systematically and relentlessly externalize the costs of their production while retaining the profits generated by their ownership of the means of production. And this tendency, of course, has led to the current existentially dangerous climate crisis. Unfortunately, however, the elites who run Western mainstream political parties that are ostensibly committed to environmental preservation remain largely hostile to socialism, in my experience. They fail or refuse to understand that socialism presents the best and, in fact, only path to climate justice. And a stark example of this hostility, which I want to talk about briefly, is the recent expulsion from the Green Party of Canada of the leader of the Green Party of Quebec, something that happened only within the last couple of weeks. In Canada, by the way, there are over 10 Green parties, one at the federal level and the others at the provincial level. Only one of those Green parties is led by an individual who identifies as a socialist, and that party is the Green Party of Quebec. Its leader is Alex Terrell, and a full disclosure, I served briefly in Mr. Terrell's shadow cabinet and on the executive committee of the Green Party of Quebec shortly before the launch of the Green Party of Canada's leadership contest in 2020. Earlier this month, the Green Party of Canada, the federal party, took the unprecedented step of expelling a sitting leader of a provincial Green Party, Mr. Terrell, from the ranks of its membership. And for over 15 years, this same party, not coincidentally, has been led by persons who refuse to embrace socialism or even to acknowledge that capitalism lies at the heart of the climate crisis. This aversion to an unabashedly socialist agenda is exemplified by the Green Party of Canada's embrace of the slogan, "Not left, not right, but forward together." The Federal Council of the Green Party of Canada did not acknowledge in justifying its expulsion of Mr. Terrell that it had anything to do with socialism. Rather, it offered essentially two reasons. First were Mr. Terrell's comments with respect to the Ukraine war, and the second were his criticisms of the federal party stance on the Canadian tar sands. With respect to the Ukraine war, several weeks ago, Mr. Terrell committed the unpardonable sin of arguing that flooding Ukraine with NATO weaponry would only prolong the Ukraine war and worsen the destruction of the country. While expressing his opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Mr. Terrell argued that the Russian government does have at least some legitimate grievances, primarily the relentless expansion of NATO to Russia's borders, and that the most humane and ecologically responsible course of action would be to negotiate a diplomatic solution to the conflict, one in which both sides would be called upon to make significant concessions. When Mr. Terrell publicly advocated for a negotiated resolution of the Ukraine war, he was vilified by Canada's right-wing media as a Putin apologist. The interim leader of Canada's Green Party harshly rejected Mr. Terrell's position on the Ukraine war, as did the leader of the Green Party of Ontario. The latter went so far as to express enthusiastic support for Western weapons transfers to Ukraine and for the imposition of the harshest possible sanctions on Russia. With respect to Canada's tar sands, Mr. Terrell committed another unpardonable sin, namely after the former leader of Canada's Green Party, Elizabeth May, stated some years ago in Canada's Parliament that the Green Party of Canada was not opposed to the tar sands. And after that same federal leader offered a climate plan which envisioned that exploitation of the tar sands would continue beyond 2050, Mr. Terrell criticized the federal party for being too soft on the tar sands, which, as many of you will know, is an extraordinarily dirty form of petroleum extraction. Now, despite these reasons, Mr. Terrell has appealed the decision of Canada's Green Party, but whatever the outcome of that appeal may be, this step by the federal party has further damaged the Green Party's standing within the Canadian socialist movement. Its standing with Canada's socialist movement was already skating on thin ice, even before Mr. Terrell's expulsion. In the 2020 leadership contest in which I ran and which Radhika mentioned, 2 of 8 candidates identified as eco-socialists. I was one of those candidates. The other was Miriam Haddad, an immigration lawyer from Quebec. And during that leadership contest, both Ms. Haddad and I were expelled from the contest temporarily. We were ultimately reinstated after public outcry and successful appeals. In my case, the justification offered for my expulsion was based on my criticism of Israel and its promoters in Canada's parliament. At the end of the day, conflicts such as these suggest very much that mainstream environmental parties in the West have been captured to some degree by constituencies that are committed to capitalism and its corollary, militarism. In my opinion, nowhere is this capture more evident than in the German Green Party. Germany's Green Party is a member, of course, of the governing coalition in Germany. Its former leader is now Germany's foreign minister. She and the Green Party of Germany have taken a position on the Ukraine war that is, in my view, to the right of the other members of Germany's governing coalition. She demands that Germany escalate its arms shipments to Ukraine and extend and deepen its sanctions on Russian oil and gas. These policies have resulted in perverse outcomes for the environment. First, Germany has now been forced to reactivate coal-fired power plants that had been mothballed. And second, Germany must now rely for its energy to an even greater degree on maritime shipments of fracked gas from the United States. Fracking, of course, being another extraordinarily dirty form of petroleum extraction. So discouraging developments such as these highlight, in my view, why Salvatore's book is so important and so timely. It will help us very much to make the case as socialists within the global green movement that socialism is the best and indeed only path towards ecological salvation. So as a disgruntled member of the global green movement, I want to extend my gratitude to Salvatore for this critically important work. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dimitri, for that very practical and I think broader contextualization. I think that serves to remind us just how difficult it is to pursue a green agenda in capitalism. So I would say that since I don't see Andrew being back, Salvatore, I will hand over to you. I've given everybody roughly 10 minutes, although I haven't been the strictest of chairs, and I will give you 15 since you have to answer quite a lot of different comments. So, but if you of course want to end earlier, that's great too. And then thereafter, we will go to the question and answer session. And I see already that some really interesting and important questions have been raised. So I look forward to a great discussion. So Salvatore, please go ahead.
Many thanks to such incredible thoughtfulness. I'm completely humbled by the positivity, the constructive critiques, and I feel very lucky to be among you. And I'm not sure whether I'll be able to provide satisfactory answers to all the very deep questions that have been raised. I will try my best. So, to some extent, I may have misunderstood what the question might be. What Dimitri especially shared with us, I think it resonates a lot with what motivated the writing of the book, and perhaps it might be it might make more sense to view the book in that light, in terms of the kinds of green politics that have prevailed, especially in the imperialist countries like the US, where I live. So perhaps a lot might follow just from contextualizing the book that way. Speaking about contextualization, about which I really want to thank Professor Pang for pointing out. It's one of those things that for me is very important as well. I guess I'll start according to the discussion lineup, with Max's comments and and questions and critique. So with respect to I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. So, but there's quite a lot that has been voiced. Anyway, the logic of comparison problem. I think I didn't do enough. Man, that's for sure. If I have any alibi at all about what's missing in the book as well, is really the page maximum limitation that was imposed to the publisher, as you probably would likely know when you've written books. But I tried the best I could to I guess look at the relational aspects, and for me it's really a dialectical materialist analysis really that I'm trying to employ through the case studies. And the USSR, for example, how the USSR in various ways changed even the discourse about the environment at the international level. So that's, and then how also the USSR was affected by the international pressures, and how that also shaped the different kind of environmental policies and limitations of what they could do, as well as looking at the faults within. But of course, the aim of the book is really, perhaps again, to not to skirt the questions, but just to provide some reasoning why I need to do further work in future, and I couldn't do it in that book, is because that book really is aimed as an introduction, especially to a lot of younger folks, because I'm teaching at undergraduate level all the time. There are a lot of younger folks who were really interested in socialism. There was this burgeoning interest, but what they find for the most part, especially about the environment, it's such rubbish that's really something that I wanted to provide. And so you probably have noticed that there's a chapter devoted to a history of socialism, simply because, I mean, you don't get that kind of education in imperialist countries at all. And if you get it, it's really a standard kind of liberal democracy, triumphalist, take on socialism. So that's part of the problem that I was trying to tackle with the book, and that took also quite a bit of room. And then the other bit was trying to contribute to convincing people, especially in imperialist countries, about really the need to reconsider their ways a lot more, to have a rethinking of how environmental struggles are being thought about, because I've been very dissatisfied, to be frank, including with the notion of extractivism. I've recently written on it, because there seems to be a conflation between the world system position that a lot of, for example, Latin American countries find themselves in, and socialist governments are trying to do better. There's a conflation between that and the kinds of policies that are developed within those same countries about extractivism. And then missing from that is, maybe it's more than just it's not really maybe a conflation, but more than that is kind of this. It seems to me a refusal, especially in the intellectual left, to come to grips with the fact that the problem really is that whatever the left is, just failed historically to bring about revolution. That's why there's a problem of extractivism, so that also is partially what animates, the book in some respects. Is kind of saying, look, let's look at the entire context. Let's look at what actually was achieved that was good, instead of just bearing down on all these negatives, especially for people who are coming from imperialist countries where it's been a complete and utter failure in terms of any revolutionary prospects so far. So another reason why we should draw from what socialist states have achieved, however one wants to call them. So in any case, I completely agree with Max in terms of having to more clearly and forcefully state that the environmental crisis is a global north crisis. It's induced by it historically, it needs to be very forcefully stated, much more than it was. As for the other, and I'm sorry, Max, if I didn't completely answer the logical comparison problem that you identify, please, I hope you'll come back to that and then set me straight. But with the rest of the questions that you raised, the agricultural achievements, that's actually my ignorance and the harried state in which I was to write that book. So I have no excuse for it, and that's what I need to improve on. And thank you also, Professor Pang, for pointing it out. These are very important issues. I tried with my limited understanding to bring to light, the importance of the communes in bringing about economic development that really worked quite well, and that enabled, kind of set the stage for what came later. And to echo what John Ross has been talking about quite a bit, is just, the achievement has been staggering. 800 million people lived out of poverty is no joke, within a couple of decades. So, how is that achieved? Well, you also need to consider the communes, the protracted People's War, and all that. So I'm very glad you raised that, and that's something that I need to improve on in terms of getting a better understanding and reading more on that. And the PRC has overshot the limits. I suppose one could say that. I think that was the question. What do we make of that? Well, I think that's something that is a part of the struggle of the past decade, and hopefully it will go in the proper direction. I'm not sure what else I can say about that, but because of the changes since '78, and I've noticed this also about state socialist Hungary. When you had that was part of my dissertation studies. I've lived there and whatever. But part of what I've noticed happening is that when they started to bring about the reforms towards greater integration with the core capitalist countries, that's when things started going downhill rather rapidly in terms of impacts on soil. So I'm not too surprised that something similar has happened in the PRC, but being a much larger country, of course, it's multiplied to a large degree. However, one also always has to bring back another aspect to this in terms of per capita emissions. This is not a critique of your question at all, or what you raised, Max. It's just, I think it needs to be oftentimes raised also that per capita emissions in the PRC are like maybe half of what they are in the US. So what is the excuse of the US? What is the excuse of liberal democracy? It should be like the issue as well. The influence on the PRC on, this is fantastic. I love that question that you raised about the influence of Maoism in the 60s and 70s. I actually don't know that much about it. I would love to read work on that. I hope somebody will be writing a book if it's not already in existence, because I think that's a fantastic question. How did the environmental movements, like let's say in Italy, that's what I'm more familiar with, become inflected by the rising popularity of Maoism? And of course, that was in contrast to the Italian Communist Party. That was, to say the least, in tension with Maoism, to say the least. And so the environmentalist movement, the leftist part of it, whatever there was of it, which wasn't that much, and it was mostly among the working classes, but which is another story, I guess. That one might want to look at those kinds of politics in light of those tensions between the Italian Communist Party and the wider extra-parliamentary left. So, but those questions, I'm afraid, I completely ignored in the book, and it would be great to take them on. About the necessary level of development of productive forces to protect oneself from, especially the US capacity to enforce a low value. I love the way you state that. I wish I knew. That's something that that actually is beyond my capacity. I think it would be great to focus an entire volume on that alone, on that question alone, drawing for as many experiences historically as possible, and including especially Max, really good point about bringing in the developmentalist state. I think is important. I completely had short-shrifted the amazing things that were actually even achieved, even if briefly, in Iraq, after the revolution, for example, or in Libya, with all, critiques one can have of Gaddafi. But those are issues that I think are important to tackle. And of course, you bring up in your work, Max, the Tunisian context, which I'm still learning from you about, and I think that's something that is extremely important. My inability to read Arabic is one pathetic alibi, but because I could try to look for translation work. So I'm going to be relying more on your work, Max, as well. Sponge off of you. But perhaps, I don't know, in light of that, with the Sayed attempt to wrest control of the state, that's something that maybe you can also update us about. It has nothing to do with our discussion. That's something that I feel like it might be important to talk about in terms of prospects for socialism in countries like Tunisia at the moment, and how that could be related to environmental struggles, because there are quite a few, of course, in Tunisia, as you know much better than me. Ipshita, you were much too, what can I say, kind to me. Although I must admit that the anarchist side of me is something that has waned and I think has been discarded by now. So the book is also kind of a personal journey out of that, and I'm afraid that my anarchist comrades will not like what I say, and for good reason, because I don't associate with that kind of movement now for quite a while. And even though I do appreciate and sympathize with a lot of what especially anarchist communists have achieved in the past and continue to try and to develop. But in any case, I'm so glad that you appreciated the use of the master's tools, and I need to do more of that. In fact, that chapter really, I agree with you, actually should have been much larger, should have been much more involved, deepened. An ecological world systems theory. Ooh. I don't know if I'm the right person to do that, but I like the idea a lot, and it's something that I would like to work on, because what has been produced so far in terms of ecology and world systems actually is a lot more about the social side and very little on the ecological side. And I'm actually, one of the things that I want to work on is to really look critically at unequal exchange, ecological unequal exchange. I think there are problems with it, empirical problems with it, in terms of how ecosystems are actually understood through that theoretical framework. Not that I would reject it at all. I think it just needs to be improved, not rejected. But I see quite a few problems that I think maybe I could insert my background in soil science, environmental science, to bear upon that, and maybe contribute something positive. Although already it's a very, very powerful framework. I think it's very useful politically. I think it's really good, and I wouldn't want to touch that, because especially in terms of the very serious fight that needs to be done about climate debt and ecological debt. That's something that I kind of put in the book as well, but I never really developed, but I think is really fundamentally important. And so, that's why I would be careful about like critiques of unequal ecological exchange as well. And that brings me to the political context, which is why I especially appreciated Dimitri's sharing with us the situation in the Green Party of Canada. I'll come back to that, I guess, because I want to keep the order of the speakers. So to show how nature is a mechanism of extraction, that is something, that it's as if you're like anticipating the kind of stuff that I really want to work on as well in the future. Because another thing that we're trying to work on is to take the concept of the wealth of nature in Marx and really and then take issue with a lot of socialist thinking that seems to have forgotten that aspect of Marx. Even ecological Marxism seems kind of bereft of the nature side a lot of the time, because it's kind of like this generic nature, and we have the wherewithal to get beyond that. So I want to work on that as well, but that would be really a separate volume, and I think it's something that I hope in future to have the time to work on, to disrupt those categories as well, as you well put it, Ipshita. But of course, you're right, just like Max, the relational aspect needs to be amped up. The dialectical aspect needed to be much more fully developed. And in part, the reason was because the brevity of the book. I couldn't really devote that much to it as I wanted to, but I frankly need to do more work on it myself anyway. I don't think it would have been as good. So if I actually wrote it up to a much greater length, it might not have been really up to to standard. So that's another project in itself. But I've been trying to work on that in another way, with trying to tie up as well, I suppose, the biophysical sciences in terms of developing Marxist method that would be appropriate for the biophysical sciences, not reducing the biophysical sciences to it, but neither having a biophysical science that just takes for granted bourgeois ideology. So that's part of that project, that long-term project. Wow, I think I already have like 4 books. I don't think my lifetime is going to be long enough, but we'll see. To go to Professor Peng Zhao Chang, thank you very much as well. I mean, the first thing I must say is that it's a relief to know that I didn't completely botch the job on the People's Republic of China. That's my biggest fear, because although I've been going back and forth to to People's Republic of China now for 7 years, and I'm engaged with some of the ecological Marxists, especially, well, they wouldn't call themselves ecological Marxists because they would be redundant. That's what I've learned, and it should be viewed as redundant. But with some of the Marxist circles there, and I've become a little bit more knowledgeable of things, and really I'm drawing from whatever has been written, and so it was a big relief to know that I'm not completely out of line, and what you have laid out actually, and that you shared with us, I hope it's already like an article that you have published, because if for one, I would like to read it and learn from it. I only recently had the pleasure of reading your article on agroecology, which I find really important in terms of understanding the pitfalls of agroecology when it's viewed only as a smallholder kind of politics, and which I wanted to bring in Walter Rodney on this. In fact, maybe this could be the chance to do it, because he had an excellent article in 1967, which was a critical take on TA and new policies in Tanzania, and he looked very carefully at what is possible with respect to mobilizing smallholder farming systems to get out of a new colonial situation, and he saw very precisely how much it's wanting, and how much you need to have a lot more than just promoting smallholder farming systems. Not that he was jettisoning it; it's just that how the challenge is how do you bring millions of households, even if they're involved in ujamaa, how do you bring them in to do something that is much greater than themselves, to be able to actually feed an entire country? It's not a simple matter, and I think the industrial farming methods that usually get very sometimes scathingly critiqued, and rightfully so, for how they've been used. But the problem is that industrial farming methods are not necessarily as destructive as it's made out to be. And this is why I think your article is important. It's something that I would like to follow through as well at some point, because of my soils background, because I also got a soil health training, and I know that there are industrial methods that can be much more constructive. So bringing that to the relationship between science and politics, I think is really, really crucial. And I did appreciate it so, and so thank you for that. Mao's ideas about what now would be called agroecology. So I really need to go back and read much more those texts. If you can share with me, but in particular the Mao's writings on this, I would really appreciate it too. I need to be educated on it much more. I think it's fantastic, because one of the things that I was having trouble with is to find in the literature, a lot more about the kinds of achievements done about ecological sustainability since 1949. And so I need to really get much deeper knowledge about it, as well as the more recent, past decade. I have to say I really appreciate a lot, and I think maybe by the time I was writing the book, I certainly didn't do any justice to it as I should have. I tried to make clear that there have been a lot of steps, a lot of progress made in terms of environmental monitoring that wasn't there before in the past decade. For me in particular, it's soils that I focus on, but the afforestation and reforestation is just incredible what the achievements have been since 1950. And the more I read about it, the more incredible it is. And that I didn't emphasize enough, I think, which is actually interesting because so it has kind of ebbs and flows, from the 50s to the present. But in the present, I think a lot more strides have been made, including how to introduce, forests that are not just plantations. And there's quite a lot of movement towards that is not being talked about, and that could be rather important. But also the sort of the clearing the skies of a lot of pollution, that is also a major achievement. I mean, it took decades in California. I lived in LA, where there would be many days in the summer, sometimes weeks, in which you couldn't go outside without having a threat to your lungs if you were young or if you're elderly. And it took decades for them to get their act together through a lot of heavy-handed state intervention. That has been resolved, a couple of years or something like that? I don't know exactly the timing, but that's just phenomenal. And it brings to light what can be achieved through a socialist state. Although I don't call the PRC a socialist state, it's just a nomenclature thing, and I hope that it's understood that what I'm trying to do is to really figure out, well, what extent of socialist kind of politics are prevalent, and then compare it to the environmental record that stems from that, and vice versa. The extent to which a socialist state adopts capitalist kind of practices, or enables parts of them as much under control as they can be, and then what the effects of that are. Basically, it's trying to understand how different levels of, or different combinations of mixed economies, as my friends and colleagues, some of them here, Mele Gottila especially, has reminded me about, that, and of course Radhika as well, and that we're working on the Polanyi Institute. There's a plug for the Polanyi Institute. That I wanted to give, and here's my excuse for it. But anyway,
sorry, Salvatore.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Please wrap up soon, because there are lots of questions, so we want to get to the questions.
Yeah, and so Ingo, what you point out, I also sympathize with, and I think you're correct, and I need to look at the dissident movements, what they also brought out, what the political aspects are, what all those sorts of things. But also at the end of the day, we also have to see what is achievable on the ground. And I think that on the whole, with all the horrendous stuff that also happened, we also have to look at in terms of the ecological outcomes, what it's come about. And so I couldn't really address and do any justice to what you raised, which is really important. Because my book was so focused on really the environmental record aspect. And if I would have opened it to other aspects, it would have been very difficult to have a book that would not have been shorter than 1,000 pages for sure, if not longer. But I do appreciate raising that. It's very important. I also am very worried of having done wrong to, in terms of the DDR, the GDR, and in terms of like understating the repression. At the same time, I also don't want to give, I hope that's not offensive, but I also don't want to give any more ammunition to those damn capitalists who want to see the end of us. And this is why Dimitri's statements are so important to me. I mean, I'm honored that I can be of any use whatever in that struggle. So thank you very much, Dimitri, for sharing that. The hostility towards socialism among environmentalists is huge, and it's a huge obstacle, especially in imperialist countries. So if that book can be of any use towards it, that's really, the work has achieved its aims in a large respect. So thank you very much, Dimitri. And thanks to all of you.
Thank you very much, Salvatore. And sorry, I had to cut you off a little bit, but we have a lot of exciting questions. So let me just say once again that we are meeting in a meeting format, so everyone who has questions can put them personally. I know some of you have already been putting them in the chat, and I encourage everybody here to look at the chat because there have been some important discussions and recommendations in the chat. So take a look, but in the meantime, I have my first set of 3 questions. Salvatore, and by the way, I expect that all panelists may want to intervene in all questions. So as you want to intervene, please do so. I actually love the fact that there seems to be a sort of a research network on socialism and the environment taking shape in the course of this panel. So yes, and you know, all the books that Salvatore was listing that should be written, I mean, he'll probably write some of them, but others can write others of them. So with that in mind, I will go to the first 3 set of questions. I have somebody called H. Hakamak, and then Yuri, and then Carlos. So please go ahead, Mr. Hakamak or Ms. Hakamak.
Hello, Salvatore. It's Henry. Nice to see you again. It's been a while since we've chatted. So I first want to thank you. I want to thank Professor Desai for chairing this meeting and thank all of the other panelists for taking part. It was a really interesting meeting, and I want to highly encourage everybody to read this book, which I have in my hand, but I forgot to uncover my camera. Read this book if you haven't read it yet. It's one of the few that I took with me when I moved to Russia. So really an important book. I find it absolutely vital. Now, Salvatore, the question that I have for you is related to something that we talked about on guerrilla history, but I was just wondering if you would elaborate a little bit more, since it's not directly related to the content of the book, but is related to building eco-socialist futures. This is the question of how do we construct narratives and how do we advance narratives that are going to be constructive for eco-socialist futures that we think are actually going to achieve the goals that we want to have. Because of course, there's many people, and I'm not going to say names, that have pushed ideas that are very catchy in social media and articles, like, these techno-modernist ideas and, mining asteroids for precious materials. Again, no names. I see Max in the comments. I know Max, you know who I'm talking about. There's many though. So, I mean, these ideas are not constructive ideas for building an eco-socialist future and constructing societies that are going to achieve the goals that we want to. So how do we take ideas like those that you presented in your book that show that there are historical parallels that we could draw on, these historical narratives that we can draw from? How do we construct those narratives in a way that breaks through the mainstream discourse and allows us to try to construct these futures going forward? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Henry. Yuri, and then Carlos. And please be as brief and to the point as possible, but yes.
Thank you, Professor, and great panelists, everyone. And I completely repeats Henry's remarks, and big shout out to Dimitri Lascaris, and I look forward to getting this book. All right, so my question to the panel is, can they respond to the findings of climate scientists that the way we consume our food, primarily meat, causes more climate change than all the car driving, plane flying, fossil fuel extractions and so forth? Is there a way we can continue our consumptions of meats and seafood in a sustainable manner, or do we really have to go to a plant-based, meat-free diet in order to live on planet Earth? And I have another question, which is, I was watching Democracy Now! Several years ago when they were covering the COP20, and Amy Goodman spoke to a radical environmentalist who said climate scientists are self-censoring their findings, that we are past the point of no return in fixing the climate and avoiding extinction of the species. So given that and the findings of the documentary Planet of the Humans, that supposedly green renewable alternatives are also bad for the environment, that plus that plus the food, is there is there really any hope for the species? Or even if there is no hope and we are past the point of no return, should we still transition to a quasi green economy, just to give the planet's lifespan a few more years or decades?
Great, Yuri, thanks. I'll take Carlos, but before I do that, can I just say that after the Carlos has posed his question, I will ask the speakers who want to respond to any of these questions to also raise their hands, and we'll do the answers and then go to another round of questions. So Carlos, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Radhika, and thanks to Salvatore and all the panelists. And well, I've only just started reading Salvatore's book, so I must apologize in advance if what I'm going to say is covered in the book, and this is completely redundant. But at the very least, I'll try and keep it sort of relatively quick. I think in relation to China, which is obviously a recurring theme within this discussion around socialist states and the environment, and is particularly relevant now. I think it's very important to recognize in spite of criticisms that people might have, that there have also been, especially in the last decade and 2 decades, there have been some really kind of important improvements and innovations that have been made, that have been coming out of the PRC. For example, 20 years ago, coal constituted 80% of China's power mix, and now that's down to around 55%, and it's going down very steadily, which is really impressive progress. And you haven't seen anything like that level of improvement in any other country, including in Australia. Australia, which is obviously an advanced capitalist country with a per capita GDP of several times higher than that of China. Coal makes up a higher proportion of Australia's power mix than China's now. Meanwhile, China's forest coverage has doubled from 12% to, I think, 23 or 24% now. China, obviously, as I think has been mentioned, leads the world now in the production and use of electric cars, electric trains, electric buses. In terms of its production of renewable energy, in terms of solar and wind energy, China's total installed capacity is greater than the US, the EU, Japan, and Britain put together. So, these are important. This is important progress that we should recognize, and I think it's worth considering, related to this question of socialist states, where that progress comes from, why it's China that's made that progress. And I would posit that it's precisely because of the nature of China as a socialist or socialist-oriented state that it's been able to do that. If people look at the US and people look at China and say, well, they're both market economies, and that's a sort of similarity between the two. But the political difference between a socialist market economy and a capitalist market economy comes down to essentially, the most concise, pithy description that I can come up with is that in a capitalist country, the interests of the capitalist class always come first before the interests of the masses. And in a socialist economy, socialist state, the interests of the masses come first. And that's precisely the reason that, in 30 years since the Rio summit, since it's been acknowledged essentially at the level of international law that we face a potentially disastrous situation in terms of climate breakdown, the countries that have left this question to the market, the Western capitalist countries, have made almost no progress. Whereas China, having decided that it was going to go down this road, that it was going to set these targets, for example, of getting to peak carbon usage by 2030 and getting to carbon neutrality by 2060, it's put serious systems in place. And it's been because it has the option to decommodify significant sections of its economy, which don't exist in a capitalist country. That's precisely why it's been able to kind of take the lead in this pursuit of renewable energy, protection of biodiversity, and pursuit of afforestation, reforestation, tackling pollution, et cetera, et cetera. So apologies if there's any kind of reiteration or kind of redundancy there in terms of what's written in Salvatore's book. But I think this is a really key point to make, that socialism creates political and economic environment in which saving the planet is possible. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Carlos. So which of the panelists would like to respond to any or all of these points? Ipsita, go ahead.
I thought Saeed had the first go. No. I just wanted to respond generally, but more particularly to Yuri's comment about greenwashing and the question of sustainability. In recent times, the World Bank produced the Eco-2 report, and the Eco-2 in this is economy and ecology, and they go together. That we can have green corporations producing green buildings, and that way capitalism can continue to accumulate and make profit, and we also take care of nature. So that is the liberal capitalist view about how sustainability should proceed. Well, my friend was trying to buy a sustainable home. It cost close to $1 million. And I said, well, the indigenous people in the country that I was born has been producing sustainable homes for $0. It's called a mud hut. And so what I was trying to say in terms of alienation that Ingo mentioned, and in terms of nature, I think that is the problem in our empirically grounded research when we externalize the problem as the ecosystem or the environment that needs to be fixed. And somehow the profit maximizing mechanism can actually fix it. And what I was trying to say, and I think what Ingo was trying to say, is that we need to reevaluate how we relate to nature. It's not about solving or reducing an emission here and dealing with climate data over there. It's how we relate to ourselves and with each other and with nature through the process of consumption. That needs to be fundamentally reimagined. The problem is the capitalist structure in which we inhabit creates a hegemonic imagination that prevents that reimagination of an eco-socialist future. I live in an Energy Star rated home, but it is a huge house. It's all the glass panes, etc. Everything protects and prevents the energy loss, but it's too much space. Why do I live there? Because my kids need to go to a good school. That is the structure. That is the capitalist American structure. You are forced to live very far away from your university, where you cannot avail any public transport. So you have to keep a car and you have to buy excess space so your kids can reimagine an environmentally sustainable future by living in a very environmentally sustainable home at the same time, which is consumptive. So we really cannot solve problems if it is imagined and external. It starts with the body and how we consume. And that's why we are implicated in that criticism. And hence the need for understanding concepts like alienation. How have we become alienated from nature while imagining the environment and the ecosystem as problems to be fixed? The problems are not out there. The problems are how we are living it and the socio-spatial structures that we've created. And that is, I think, the fundamental systemic difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism, the unit of analysis is the individual. I recycle, I bike, I'm doing my part of the environment. If you're not doing it, it's your problem. If you would do it, the system would change. The socialism format is different. It's like we are all correlated. We are all related to each other. And one individual changing one thing is not going to change anything. It is how we as a community reimagine ourselves relating to each other in a kind, non-extractive, non-accumulative way. And how that, the reimagining yourself is also fundamentally involved in reimagining nature. That's the de-alienated view, that we are connected to each other and we are connected to nature. And it doesn't have to be spiritual hocus pocus. It's basic socialism as a different format to capitalism, which is more individualistic. I am doing my part, you need to do your part. We all need to do our part. And in doing that part, we have to fundamentally reimagine the socio-spatial structures. As Dimitri said, it's the only way. It cannot be environmentalistic within capitalism. That's an oxymoron. So I just end there.
Okay, well, on that ringing note, would any of the other panelists like to respond? Anyone? Xiaoshan, please go ahead, and then Salvatore.
Yeah. So first, because Salvatore talked about additional materials he would like to read, and just now in the chat window, Max recommended important work. by Professor Sigrid Smarzer. Sigrid Smarzer. By chance, Professor Sigrid Smarzer, she is a historian at UMass Amherst, who was also sitting on my dissertation committee along with my chief advisor David Katz and my co-chair Jim Boyce. Jim Boyce is also a pretty renowned environmentalist economist at UMass Amherst. So definitely, I would like to recommend Professor Sigrid Smarzer's work on this important topic, because she has been doing she has been studying Maoist peasant movement to build ecological science for a long time. And I also in the past several days, by chance I came upon an important literature that's translated into English, because most of the literature on this topic has been in Chinese, I have read. But fortunately, there is a English journal edited by Sun Yat-sen's wife, Sun Yat-sen, right? The founder of the bourgeois Chinese Revolution of 1911. Sun Yat-sen's wife, Song Qingling, because she was one of the vice presidents of PRC, and she edited an English journal titled China Reconstructs that ran from 1952 to 1982. So I can send the link to that English journal to you. That basically that reflected the monthly or yearly achievements of Chinese early socialist building experience from 52 to 82. Another brief comment is on what Carlos has brought up, because Carlos offered some interesting point in the chat window and also discussed why China has been achieving ecological achievements in the past decade or so. And I would like to offer a theoretical comment. That is, this actually is related to an important theoretical literature in political science, mostly in political science, because in the past 2 to 3 decades, there's a literature called the autonomy of the state or developmental state. That's largely about the East Asian experience. However, most of the logical bent of the literature is largely about discussing that in state capitalist experience, particularly centering upon Japan, or the what we call the 4 tigers or 4 dragons in East Asia. But what about China? I think it's insufficient to use that autonomy of state framework to look at China, because China, and if we are familiar with Marx's earlier notion of the Asiatic mode of production, then we know that Chinese ancient civilization, it is much stronger version of autonomy of the state, and that has been creatively transformed in the Maoist period, and we still are enjoying the legacy of the strong state control of the economy. So not only the 1978 reform was started by this socialist state, but also even right now, the retreat of the state or the advancing of the state into the private sector, that is totally still, I think, still strongly in the hands of the state. So if the socialist state, the Central Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party government would like to take back the sphere of the private sector, it has the will, political will, and strong power to do that. So I think, but again, I would like to take a dynamic stance towards that. I don't want to say the state has not faced any threat from the capital power. So we can definitely keep a very close eye on, maybe that's an index, right? We can set up index on the power between the state and the private capital, and see what kind of advancements that we can achieve in the future. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And Salvatore, please go ahead. And before you do that, let me just say that if the members of the audience have further questions, it's now your turn to raise your hand as well. So please go ahead, Salvatore.
Thanks. I mean, there are there are several, I guess, questions that I thought I could respond to, but I wanted to make sure to bring up also Ipshita's work on Kolkata, and she has an excellent take on greenwashing, and that can be also be used as a case in point, and I think is really important. But then it's too bad Max is not with us, because he's a People's Green New Deal, I think, speaks at least in part to what Henry was raising with respect to narratives and alternatives out there that are practicable, and also through research and historical experiences. He has a very good rundown in, I think it's the final chapter or the penultimate one. And Yuri's questions, there's a lot of cacophony out there with respect to what exactly is going on a planetary level, and I think it's on purpose. It's to I mean, I guess apocalyptic viewpoints can be very, very useful to capitalists too, I have to say, depending on which fraction of the capitalist class one is talking about. But I wanted to bring up Max's work because it also speaks to some of the things that you've touched upon, like this, like, or should we impose veganism to the entire world, which is utter nonsense if one actually looks at range management and how it actually pans out, and especially with pastoralists and then how they actually improve ecosystem conditions and developments. And there's quite a lot of literature on that. So basically, a lot of these frameworks, a lot of the way that the environmental problems are described, the way in which they're pitched to us, is very much an imperialist way of understanding the world, in which the majority of humanity is erased from view, and the only focus is on like us here, like in North America, you know, and what counts for us as doom, or what counts for us as betterment. But the rest of the world doesn't count, apparently. So that's why you can have Bastani. I will name Bastani. I mean, that kind of work is complete rubbish. It's not communism at all. It's actually the opposite, because it's an imperialist framework, you know, mining asteroids. I mean, that's just incredible that stuff even gets published and gets put, you know, pitched as communist. But maybe I should just stop there before I go out of control. Thanks. Radhika, I'm afraid we can't hear you. Yes.
Yes, sorry, I just had a... Okay, so, okay, for now, Salvatore, you can, you are ending. I have another question from somebody who is labeled AppCam. So please go ahead with your question.
It's Charles McFadden from Fredericton, New Brunswick. Good friend of Dimitri's and supporter of his campaign. And very much interested about the environmental, ecological, political movement in Canada, and the Green Party in particular, and the disastrous outcome of recent events, and where we go from there. In that respect, if I can, and asking that my question just perhaps to Dimitri and others, point out that our neighbor to the south, the U.S. Green Party, is an eco-socialist party. It's in the belly of the beast. So such an animal does exist, the Green Party that is eco-socialist, and they are revolutionary. Just note that Jamo Baraka, Margaret Kimberley, and others are leaders in that movement, in that party. But my question really is related to what I thought was a very important question that Max raised. He asked the question, what level of industrial development would be needed for the socialist countries, let us say those resistant to imperialism and wanting an alternative form of global civilization, what level of industrialization would they need to realize that ambition? My question then is there evidence, maybe I really want to ask, is there not evidence in immediate recent developments that would begin to answer that question in the affirmative? That is, and I'm expressing an opinion here, is not the inability of the US NATO-led war proxy war in Ukraine and its inability, as it seems to me, to defeat the socialist movement and to turn the world back to more right-wing neoliberalism. Is that not an indication that the level might actually be present?
Thanks very much. Before I go to the speakers for answers, because I think that exhausts the questions. So maybe what we'll do is we will wrap up the session by asking all the panelists to make some concluding remarks, including addressing the last question and any other points that were raised by other panelists, by the speakers, etc. And I think I'd like to begin with Ingo, because I know he has to go in the next 5 or so minutes. So Ingo, would you like to start, please?
Yeah, just very briefly, on the question of alienation again, and the relations between the individual to society. I remember saying that my East German actually existing working class family in the East it was private before catastrophe. Private meant the family. It was kind of complete withdrawal from society there. And catastrophe was the party, was society and the state and all the rest of it. And I think this has been a disaster, and many recognized after the not so much liked state socialism was gone, that there was actually something people lost. And people in other parts of the world noticed even more, even though they may not be aware that they lost something because the Soviet Union disappeared. But it also comes back these days very often. Like I see these memes on Facebook, and I plead guilty of being active there, saying that Jeff Bezos and his friends are responsible for so many % of world pollution. And empirically that might be true, but it's a problem to think that way, because it absolves all the rest of us of any kind of responsibility. It's kind of, well, if we get rid of those guys, problem will be solved. And this, I think, is alienation at its deepest level, because it logically implies that we could, the rest of us who don't fly rockets to the moon could continue as we always did, despite the huge disparities across the globe between suburbians worrying about their mortgages after the interest rates went up, and people living in mud houses, ecologically more sustainable than anybody in the north. But obviously there's a level of inequality that's also not sustainable in any ways. So we really have to find out what individual responsibility means in relation to non-human nature and in relation to our fellow humans. If we want to move forward, we have to find, I think the first question was about narratives. We have to find narratives. And Yuri asked about hope. Even if there is no hope, I think there's nothing else we can do but pretend there is to be, and maybe by pretending on a sufficiently large scale and coming up with a narrative that inspires people to work towards a better future, we might eventually achieve something. And thanks very much. And sorry that I have to leave. I'm sitting in my sister's kitchen, and we will soon start making some food here. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingo. And I will just go down the list of people as they spoke. Since Max is not here, Andrew is not here, I will go next to Ipsita, then to Xiaochang, Dimitri, and then Salvatore. So Ipsita, please go ahead.
Oh, I had left the room for a little bit. What are we doing here?
Right, so we're just wrapping up because there are no further questions. So if you have anything to add to what you've already said, please go ahead. And we are just giving concluding simple statements.
So just my spiel about the relationality of human existence. And I know Ingo just said non-human nature and the human. And in the relational context, there is no longer any non-human nature because humans are everywhere. Even by taking a picture of a mountain, you've humanized nature and commodified it. And I think the challenge is how to decommodify our future. That is the essential link for a better future. I don't want to use the term sustainability. Any term that you throw out is co-opted immediately. So I think there should be a power of silence and power of action, not say anything and actually do it. My spiel about dialectics is how we relate to each other is how we practice dialectics. And as researchers, we find it very hard to be dialectical. In an interpersonal level, it is probably much more easier to be compassionate. It is harder to be compassionate at the empirical level when you have to dismantle the master's house, you're using the tools, you're using the concepts, and you often degenerate into analysis, even while you're trying to be dialectical. Just for the audience who is non-academic here, the antithesis of an analytical view of the world is the relational view of the world. The analytical view of the world is the more scientific, the mainstream, isolate and analyze. And so it's my life is different from your lives. I'm doing better, so you should do better. All lives, we all have to do better. In order for us to raise our common future. So I think the dialectical part is important and not very well understood. So I'll just read a little bit from Engels' Dialectics of Nature, and I think it applies directly to what Said was doing without saying it. So one of the laws of dialectics, Engels is saying, is the law of transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. And I think this is how we can empirically disrupt non-dialectical research that claims to be science, which is actually unscientific, but claims to be scientific. It is unscientific because it is reductionist. It reduces nature to just emissions or carbon cap and trade or just sustainable buildings without fundamentally reimagining an unalienated existence. And I think the path towards that unalienated existence is the philosophical gold that Said is trying to claim in terms of a better future, whether you want to call it eco-socialist or otherwise. Say something benign so everybody accepts. For the political candidates in here, don't say socialist, say something else, just so that it's much more acceptable. But again, the concept is also important. We want to hold on to the concept. So what does Engels mean by quantity and quality? So this is what he says, the law of transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa. For our purpose, we can express this by saying that in nature, in a manner exactly fixed for each individual case, qualitative changes can occur only when there are quantitative additions or quantitative subtractions of matter or motion, so energy. So I think that is what Said was trying to show, how you add, when you add carbon and methane over a period of time, what kind of qualitative changes happen. And I think that is the dialectics, understanding how human life and science are connected. And when science doesn't speak to the reality, the complexity, the chaos of human life, it reduces nature to a set of variables that need to be fixed. And then corporations can come in and prepare green buildings and prepare new materials, and the problem is fixed. Problem is not fixed because life is much more complex. So science needs to be more complex. It needs to be more relational. Research needs to be more relational. I think the normal human being understands that it is complex, but at the intellectual level, we simplify it. Even at the political level, when we give political speeches, etc., we have to simplify it. And I think that's the balance that Said is trying to strike here, how to speak to students, and in a way that they will understand the eco-socialist future in a more empathic way. But then how to talk about alienation also in there? It becomes 1,000 pages. But I think we have to do that. I think we have to talk about alienation there. We have to talk about dialectics there, because the alternative is that the logical empiricists and the capitalists are doing it. They are teaching it in business schools, how to take more money, and they are showing it through graphs and pictures and numbers. They are doing their neoclassical theory and their neoliberal theory. And we have to do the opposite. We have to find a way to talk about concepts, connect it intellectually with science and show that it is scientific, and then show that it's also praxis, as in the political level. So I think politicians will also have to talk about concepts and make it accessible. In order for us to imagine a better future, we have to bring in politicians, green parties, etc., in our intellectual debates, which we don't bring in too much. And Saeed, you will have to talk about alienation and alternative theory of nature within the pages that you have, the page limits that you have. That is the challenge that I'm setting for you for your next book.
Okay, I can see that there is a book coming on next about what is it? Socialist states and science, how socialist states do better science than capitalist states. But that will be for the future. Zhaochang, please go ahead.
Okay. So I have learned so lot from the discussion of Salvatore's book and from the everyone's commentary and even the suggestions and points expressed in the chat in the chat window. So certainly I will come back motivated by Salvatore's work. I certainly will come back to study more carefully what the Maoist China has to offer for today's international ecological movement. But I think the key point might be that what matters most is how we can advance our ecological movement in today's context. So whatever Maoist China had already done in a brilliant way, the legacy has to be transformed to adapt to today's new context. So I think that's a very big challenge. So I'm very grateful to have learned so lot from other discussions, introduction to what the Green Party's movement have been doing and their existing conditions in Canada and in other parts of the world. So certainly, so I'm very grateful to having been a part of today's panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Zhaochang. Dimitri, please go ahead.
I'll simply conclude by commenting on Mr. McFadden's reference to the U.S. Green Party. I think he's quite right that the U.S. Green Party, even to this very day, is situated to the left of the Canadian Green Party and most of the, if not all of the Green Parties of Europe. However, I think there have been indications recently with respect particularly to the Ukraine war that a schism has opened up within the U.S. Green Party on this particularly thorny question. And I'm not sure where that ultimately is going to take us, but it is interesting and remarkable, frankly, that of all the parties in the West from the global green movement, it is often the United States Green Party which takes the most boldly progressive or socialist position, particularly with respect to questions of foreign policy. Why that's the case, I don't know. But I've often noticed as a Canadian Green that we don't, I mean, when I say we, I'm talking about the leadership of the Green parties in this country. They don't talk much about the US Green Party. They're constantly expressing the love and affection for European Greens, but they don't even want to seem to acknowledge the existence of their eco-socialist cousins to the south of the border, which is rather odd. Anyways, one day I hope to figure out that strange aspect of the global green movement. Thank you for having me participate in today's event.
Thanks very much, Dimitri. And okay, Salvatore, you have the final word.
Something that I cannot stand to have, but thank you. Well, I'm very grateful to all of you who participated, and even just for attending, and whatever can be taken positive from this book already makes it, having been a worthwhile endeavor. I've also learned quite a bit, and I hope to read the works that have been recommended soon as well, and to improve upon what I have just started to do, really. And I really would like to strongly suggest that anybody who thinks that it's an important thing to do to promote a very different understanding of what socialist states have achieved, you know, compared to the standard view in imperialist countries like ours here. And please, you know, take that up. It's important. Speaking about countering the, predominant narrative. Unfortunately, in the US, we're not in a position in which we have institutions that can help us out. We do not have schools of Marxism as in the People's Republic of China. We do not have Telesur. We don't have so many outlets that we should have in order to be able to promote a discussion that is serious and that actually is politically have a much greater reach. I'm hoping that with Dimitri's tireless work and with the work of the comrades, if I dare say so, with the eco-socialist ones in the US Green Party, keep up the good fight. It's certainly worthwhile, but we're in a great disadvantage in North America, of course. And I hope that in some ways, the book I've written will be helpful in any way. If it is, fantastic. If I can be helpful in any way, besides that, let me know. I hope I can be helpful some other ways as well. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Salvatore, and thanks to all the panelists, all the audience. I think we've had some wonderful discussions. I really think we've raised our awareness, our collective awareness about where things are at and why it is so important to recover and re-present to the world the record of socialism on a whole range of fronts, particularly on the critically important ecological front. So thank you again. Let me remind everybody that if you like this discussion, we will have another in 2 weeks about another critically important issue, whose importance Dimitri just underlined by talking about this split in the Green Party in the United States. I hope it's not very serious, but it certainly shows that the position the left must take on Ukraine is increasingly important, and we all need to be very clear about the stakes if there is to be a left at all, let alone an eco-socialist left, a feminist left, etc., etc. So I hope that many of you will be there. And until then, I would like to say goodbye on behalf of the International Manifesto Group. If you are curious about who we are, please check us out at www.internationalmanifesto.org. And thanks very much for coming. Bye-bye.